Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Professor, for moderating, and La Alianza, thank you so much for hosting this, and the International Law Journal, and of course, all of you for coming here today. Let me tell you first a little bit about my district, the 13th Congressional District in New York City. It's in many ways, it's a very iconic district. Prior to me coming to Congress, it had only been represented by 2 members of Congress in 75 years. First by someone we call the line of Lenox Avenue, Charles B. Rangel, who was the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And prior to him, with a real giant member of Congress, the late and great Admiral Clayton Powell, who I believe still holds the record for the most legislation passed of any Congress members. And he was the architect of the safety net for poor people in the country. I urge you all to Google his speech, What's in Your Hand. It's a real inspiring speech that I'm sure you'll enjoy. But it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here. I want to talk about a piece of legislation that I've introduced, HR 2725, which is one that calls for a commission to study wrongful interventions by the United States government abroad. And I'm sure you heard in many places that the Caribbean is our third border. And in fact, I think that it is very much, in many ways, our third border. And it has had a historic and keen interest in American politics for many, many decades. Starting in 1869, when President Grant, Ulysses Grant, showed an interest, a defined interest in annexing, in making the Dominican Republic a state of the nation. In fact, there were some regional advantages to it, particularly naval advantages, because of the Bay of Samaná, which is strategically placed in a location that would have given the United States a clear advantage to protect the hemisphere from the European powers. Samaná is a beautiful peninsula that was settled by emancipated former American slaves and was constructed by several thousand of those individuals. And many of them and their descendants still live there right now. And they speak English, and they call the church La Churcha. And so on Sunday you'll see a lot of people going through the churcha. And it's a wonderful place. But it was of a great importance to the US government. President Grant summons no other than the great Frederick Douglass to head a commission out there and see how we could annex and make the Dominican Republic a state. That was brought to the Senate, where it failed to gain the 2/3 votes that it needed to make it happen. In fact, it was a tie vote. And as such, it died right there on the floor of the Senate. But that was perhaps the first sign of interest in that territory by the US government. And of course, anytime there is an interest on any territory, there are implications for that territory as they move forward. The next interaction was in 1916, when the Marines intervened and occupied the island due to a pending customs debt with the American government. And they stayed there for a total of 8 years. During that period of time, the United States government recruited an individual by the name of Rafael Leonidas Trujillo, who was a captain in the National Guards there, the National Army, trained by the U.S. Marines. Subsequently, he became president of the Dominican Republic and was its dictator for over 3 decades, very much shaping the politics of the island for not just for decades, but perhaps, I would say, until now, I dare to say. That had, of course, not just political and social implications, but economic implications. The 30 years of ruthless dictatorship forced a good number of Dominicans into exile, and of course created a culture of violence and a culture of gangsterism, as they say. Subsequent to that, and after his assassination, the Trujillo's assassination, there was a third intervention in 1965, after the first democratically elected President Juan Bosch was deposed of power. Over 40,000 Marines accompanied by members of the Organization of American States also occupied the island, turning it into turmoil as well during the subsequent years. That entire experience, of course, has had a dramatic impact on the social, political, economic future of the island. As such, I believe that it warrants that Congress, not the international court. We've seen cases where other countries, such as Nicaragua, have attempted to get a resolution of a dispute in the international court and have found no standing in the courts and have walked away from it. We feel very strongly that it is in the halls of Congress that these conflicts must be debated, that a commission must be put forward to study those 3 dramatic events in the history of the Dominican Republic, and that we must look for some level of repair for the wrongs that have been committed by the U.S. government. In order for our nation to continue to hold a standing in the region and in the world, we must not only highlight the great accomplishments that we've obviously done throughout the decades, but we also must acknowledge perhaps some of our missteps and address them appropriately. So through this commission, we will be able to study in depth how many casualties there were, including the destruction of property, the impact that it had on the future economies of the country, and the kind of action and remedies that we as a country should put in place. This is important, and I'm sure that it could serve as a model for future countries that perhaps have been through the same process. And so this is an important piece of legislation that will, I think, for the first time, give Congress the ability to take a deep dive into our past history and try to correct some of the wrongs. I may add that this is also a piece of legislation that for the first time in the history of the U.S. Congress has its title in both English and Spanish. And so I'll leave it at that because I'm sure that you'll have lots of questions about it, and I'm deeply grateful that you invited me, and I hope that I can answer any other questions that you may have. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Congressman. So we have a lot to talk about. We've got a lot of wonderful questions from you all. To start just with the legislation that you were just mentioning, and just an initial question, what inspired you to put this legislative proposal forward? Was it your own experience as a native Dominican? Was it the experience of your constituents? Like what exactly motivated you to do this?
Both. My experience as a young boy witnessing the last intervention, and also, of course, representing a district that has a significant number of Dominican Americans and Dominican nationals that are still, in many ways, connected to that one-time intervention, as well as I believe in in social justice, and I think that it's a matter of social justice as well. How we as a country have the ability to take a deep dive in our soul and not just speak about the good things that we've done, but correct the wrongs of the past. So this is important for the district, and I think important for our international standing as a nation, particularly now as we wrestle to try to keep our footing as the leader of the hemisphere.
Yeah, that's true. And just building on that last remark, and just to editorialize a bit, I want to express my appreciation for your work on this issue, especially, and this gets to my next question, given the pressures I imagine you must face, both as an immigrant yourself and as a representative of a largely Hispanic district. And what I mean is that the legislation and your advocacy for it is openly critical of the United States' historical role abroad in many ways. And I think it's really brave of you. But I imagine that you face sort of, at least that's a complicated decision for you in the current political environment, especially with sort of the open xenophobia we've seen, especially since the President Trump's administration. And so I just want to ask, how do you think about that? How do you think about occupying that role of sort of both, representative of a district in the United States, but also sort of holding the United States to account for its historical wrongs?
Oh, dissent is patriotic. It is a fundamental piece of our democracy, and it is a component of our democracy that we should preserve and strengthen. The ability to be critical of ourselves and to have a voice of dissent or opposition in a constructive way, I think is a strong element of democracy. And so in times where democracy is at question, our ability to understand and keep democracy moving forward as we would all like it to be, when that is at question, I think it is important to strengthen those elements that perhaps are not the most common and more popular among ourselves, but that are key elements of keeping the house together.
So just very practically, so just to go to the student question, one student wants to know, what do you think are the prospects of this legislation becoming law? And to the extent that you think that the prospects are poor, why is that? What explains, to the extent that we shouldn't be expecting this to become law in the next term?
Well, let me just say that the Organization of American States just recently resolved a long-standing dispute with the Dominican government by issuing a formal apology for their participation in the last conflict in 1965. But the issue of reparation is one that it's very common and popular right now in Congress as it pertains to the African American community. And it should not be exclusive to that experience, but it should go beyond that into those experiences of folks across the world that have witnessed or experienced a negative part of their history because of our own doing. And so I think that it stands a shot. I think the fact that we are discussing it right now and that people are aware of it is the beginning of the process, but in some other forums, as the Organization of American States, it has already taken its own form and its own legal process.
So somewhat related to the previous question, another student wants to know if there's anything you could change about the House of Representatives in terms of procedure. What would you change?
I think that it has to improve the ability for the rank and file member of Congress, the House, to be able to put forward legislation in a quicker and more efficient way. I think right now the House is very much entangled in bureaucracies that prevent the rank and file members, all 435 members of Congress, from putting forward their ideas, which are a reflection of what their constituencies want, and bringing it to the fore for a fair and robust debate. I think that we must streamline the process so that it's easier for rank and file members to be able to put forward their ideas and be more accountable to their constituencies.
So just one last question on the legislation before turning to the more general student questions. And this is a bit broader already. So as you know, the midterm elections are only about a month away. And a major topic during the run-up to those elections has been the appreciable shift among Latinx voters towards the Republican Party. Do you think legislation of the sort that you are proposing here helps to convey a commitment on the part of the Democratic Party to Latinx issues? Or more generally, what do you think the Democratic Party should be doing to reverse that somewhat troubling trend?
The Latinx community is a very diverse community. And I believe very strongly that our party has not really found the ability to communicate precisely in ways that those subsets of the Latinx community understand it. And for example, a Mexican American in Texas thinks and feels very differently than a Mexican American in California or Illinois. Dominican thinks and feels very differently than Cuban American. Puerto Rican, of course, is a territory of the United States, and so they are citizens by birth, and they feel and think very much differently than a Colombian or Ecuadorian may feel and think. And so I think our party has not been able to decipher the best way to communicate with those different groups, and as such, has lost a little bit of an edge. And I think the other side of the aisle has been able to successfully do that. I think that for the most part, young people are and their values, young Latinx people and their values are more in line with the Democratic Party than they are with the Republican Party. The messaging has been off.
So Congressman, so you've had a tremendously varied career in public interest, and that I'm sure has given you a real understanding of the experiences of the communities that you represent. Having said that, what specific communities you represent in your current position, right, is subject to change, and in part subject to the whims of state redistricting commissioners. And so for this reason, another student wants to know, in your view, how do you think the recent redistricting has affected New York's delegation and representation? And the student wants to know, do you think that some communities have less of a voice now?
Well, with regards to my district, it did not really impact very much. My district had to grow by around 50,000 new voters or residents. And as I said earlier, I have a very iconic district. I have Harlem, which is sort of like the capital of the African diaspora. East Harlem, which is the cradle of the Latino experience with the Puerto Rican presence there since the 20s and 30s. Washington Heights, which is primarily Dominican and very diverse in itself. And then the Bronx, which is a very working class borough. So my district grew in a compact and contiguous way. And I think that it incorporated communities of common interest, which is sort of like the new language for redistricting. As some of the courts stripped out the issues relating to race and ethnicity and included the concept of communities of common interest, which means basically if my mother lives in the Bronx and I live in Manhattan and I take my kid to be taken care of there by my mother, that's a community of common interest. If you have a Latino restaurant in East Harlem and you have it in the West Bronx, that's also a community of common interest. And so you try to tie it together in that way, and those are sort of like the guidelines for redistricting. With regards to the rest of the state, yes, I think it became a little bit of a mess. Originally, we had an independent commission for redistricting made up of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Unfortunately, they could not reach an agreement on the maps. The Republicans came out with one set of maps and the Democrats came out with another set of maps. I made out that the only map that they both agreed on was my district, and so I was lucky in that way. And of course, then that threw the entire process back to the legislature. The legislature drew their own map, and the courts found it to be invalid, and the courts then brought in a special master that held hearings and drew his own maps, and those are the ones that were eventually approved. So it was a little bit messy. Democrats may say, well, we lost an opportunity to gain some seats, but overall, I think that everybody lost.
So a related question goes to the relationship between the communities you represent and your ability and the way in which you can shape policy in Congress. More specifically, the student asks, how your district's demographic and economic reality affects your influence in Congress?
I think the fact that I represent all the districts that I previously mentioned strengthens my ability to get the message across. The fact that, for example, everybody knows Harlem, and now I think after the movie In the Heights, everybody knows the Heights, right? Or at least they know Lin-Manuel Miranda, right? Who was a constituent. And of course, everybody knows the Bronx because of the New York Yankees. So, because of the iconic nature of the district, it gives me a little bit of an edge. Diversity, I believe very strongly, is the strength of the city of New York, and very much the strength of my district, where maybe over a dozen languages are spoken. You have an Albanian community there, German Jewish community there, Russian Jewish community there, small Vietnamese community there, Senegalese, West Africans, Mexicans, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, African Americans. So this is a very diverse district with different needs, but I think a very strong standing in the body politic of New York City. And so whenever a colleague of mine visits a city, of course they want to come out to Harlem or Washington Heights. And I think that gives me an opening to get my message across a little easier.
So given the intensely polarized legislative environment in Congress, another student wants to know, what is the best bipartisan initiative that you've participated in?
Well, recently I have been working on nearshoring, which is our ability to bring jobs and manufacturing back to the hemisphere to positively impact the migration issues that we've seen at the border. In many ways, I think that migration is connected to primarily a lack of job, natural disasters, or violence. So if we can bring jobs back, not only will we have the ability to get our hands on PPEs in case of a future pandemic quicker, but it will also help stimulate the hemispheric economy. I think that's good for America, and that's good for the hemisphere. And so I'm working with a Republican colleague. We have a similar piece of legislation. His is a little bit different than mine, but we're working to bring it together, and that's Congressman Green.
So thinking about your career as a public servant more generally, one student asked, what has been your biggest mistake as a public servant? And what did you learn from that? Or what did you do to correct it?
I should have ran for the New York City Council. That's where that's where the resources come and things get done. I think that I learned to be more patient. The state legislature trained me because it was a bicameral body as well as Congress. And while I was there, for the years that I was there, it was a split legislature with the Republicans controlling the Senate. And at one point, there was Democratic control in both houses for a very short period of time. But for the most part, one of the houses was under Republican control. And that forces you to develop relationships with the other side of the aisle and to develop working strategies with the other side of the aisle so that you can get things done. For example, I had a piece of legislation in the state legislature, which was the in-house, the in-state tuition bill that we got passed with a Republican governor and a Republican Senate. And it was back in 2002. I mean, it was unheard of, something like that being passed during that era. But we were able to successfully get it done, impacting favorably over 8,000 students every year that were, prior to that, forced to pay out of tuition, which I'm sure many of you are aware of that, what that is. But we were able to get it done with a split legislature. And so I think it's important that we sharpen our tools and our abilities to do that.
Okay. So responding to the recent events, one student wants to know what can or should Congress do regarding Hurricane Fiona and its effect on the Dominican Republic in particular?
Well, I just came back from a trip to Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. President Biden is in Puerto Rico today as we speak. The issues affecting both islands are somewhat different. In Puerto Rico, it's more of the fragile infrastructure and the electrical grid, which unfortunately, even after money has been allocated after Maria, finds itself in very dire condition, as was proven during Fiona, which is really more an impact of flooding and the impact that it had on the electrical grid. Most of the plants are in the southern part of the island where the hurricane came in, and as a result, the entire island went dark. So we have to, FEMA has to invest in making sure that Puerto Rico's electrical grid is strengthened and that it's resilient. And it's not so much just about Fiona, but it's about tomorrow, because unfortunately the islands are on the pathway of hurricanes, and they will continue to have that type of experience. In the Dominican Republic, there was wind damage, and it's really about the homes of poor people being repaired. I mean, a roof and walls, and strengthening wood so that it will withstand future winds and tropical storms or even additional hurricanes coming through. So, and of course they don't rely on FEMA, so it has to go through USAID, the Red Cross, or an international organization, a bit more complex. And so this morning, just before I got here, I was on the phone with one of the officials from USAID, sort of expressing the need for us to be on the ground beyond the preparedness classes that they're providing for people, which I think are important and good. We must show that we're there, particularly with an ally, such as the Dominican Republic, when they really need us, and they need us now.
So, you know, we touched on the idea of bipartisanship a couple of times already. Another student wants to know, do you see any hope for bipartisan immigration reform anytime in the near future?
Well, we put forward a piece of a proposal that I thought was very practical, and I think it has a fighting chance. And it's a very simple one. It's a work permit for 5 years with the ability to extend it another 5 years. And if in the process you marry a U.S. citizen and they petition for you, then you have access to get your green card and potentially become a U.S. citizen. Simple. It's a very simple concept. And I don't see anything that could be more important than waking up in the morning, going to work, without the fear that you're going to be scooped up and deported and ripped away from your kids. A simple work permit for 5 years, so you have some tranquility and peace of mind, with the ability, you don't break the law, you stay within the parameters of what's good and fine, and then in 5 years you can apply for it again. And if in those 10 years, if you marry someone that can petition for you, then you should exercise your rights and privileges that are extended by the law. So this is a very practical proposal, and one that I think that the economy needs right now, because the economy, I don't think, will be able to get back to where we wanted to without the participation of immigrant labor, as it has been throughout our history. This is not new. Although I mean that unemployment is down, the price of gas is coming down, inflation should come down a little bit more. I think we're doing better than we were 5 months ago.
Enjoy your time as a state legislator more, or now as a federal legislator?
Well, I'll put it, I love baseball, so I'm gonna put it to you in baseball terms. Being in the state legislature was being like in a good AAA team. But being in Congress, and that's the World Series.
So I'm going to open it up to audience questions soon. I want to ask just a couple more questions about, one, going back to the immigration reform question. Do you think, is there a path forward with a sort of on a partisan line vote? Do you see, is there a path forward with a sort of, in the absence of Republican support, that we might see sort of meaningful immigration reform, suppose if Democrats were to retain both chambers of Congress?
I believe so, and the worst scenario, I think, would be for the White House and the executive to then put forward some executive orders that at least will give some relief to very specific groups that I consider low-hanging fruits, dreamers, TPS recipients, right? There's a very precise number of folks that will benefit from those initiatives if the president decides to do an executive order. But I believe that in a post midterm election scenario, that there will be greater opportunities, and that the political will may be there for us to move forward. Yes.
And more generally, what in your view would be the most important, or what would be among the most important policy goals in a post-midterm environment should Democrats retain control of Congress?
I am very concerned. I'm very concerned about the Supreme Court and the path that they have chosen to take. And I'm very concerned about the Supreme Court unraveling decades of progress. And if we see their calendar, the issues that they will take up in this coming term, voting rights, affirmative action, individual state rights, very serious stuff. And I'm very concerned about that. I think that we ought to take a deep dive at what we can do to make the Supreme Court, obviously through a very deliberate and constitutionally sound process, to make the Supreme Court a bit more, I believe, accountable to the country, to the nation, and the will of the nation.
Well, as you know, that's an answer I like to hear.
Well, we'll have that conversation.
Okay, so yeah, so at this point I thought maybe we'd turn to audience questions, if that works.
Just follow up on that last point about how you're concerned about the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Have you thought about how, maybe from like a political strategy point of view, it may not be the worst thing for Democrats if the Supreme Court is unpopular, given that Dobbs has kind of reinvigorated Democrats in places where we didn't think was going to happen. And so if you get another term of terrible Supreme Court decisions, you might have something to run on. Have you thought about that?
Well, I thought about it, but I don't think that we should be politically expedient with regards to something as serious as the Supreme Court. The standing, the institutional standing of the Supreme Court, the impartiality of the Supreme Court, the constitutional rigidness of the Supreme Court, all these elements are so important, and for it to be politicized or maybe weaponized in one direction or the other, I think is serious stuff, and we should not be politically expedient with regards to what kind of immediate benefit we may have. Certainly, with the latest decision has given us, I believe, an advantage, a political advantage, but is it the right thing to do?
Thanks so much for joining us today, Congressman. I had the opportunity to work on your piece. It's a phenomenal piece if you haven't read it. I had a question about some of the sources in the piece mention, the history of the Dominican Republic related to Puerto Rican statehood. And I was wondering if you felt like digging into the history of the Dominican Republic really affected or changed the way that you saw Puerto Rican statehood debate occurring. What your thoughts are there?
Well, I consider myself, and those that are scholars here perhaps, or have read Caribbean literature or history, you may have noted that that region has a lot in common. So I consider myself to be a Caribbean, right? First and foremost, right? That includes the Great Antilles region, the largest Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica. And so we have a lot in common. Unfortunately, the current status of each of those countries and territory are different. Right? Cuba is obviously different than the Dominican Republic, and Haiti is different than both Cuba and the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, of course, is a territory, right? And many feel, including the United Nations, that it is a colony. And in fact, there is an entire process within the United Nations about the status of Puerto Rico, colonization of Puerto Rico. But ultimately, the future of Puerto Rico lies in the hands of the Puerto Rican people. Right? And I believe very strongly that whatever process it is, it should be a robust process with a determinate voting outcome. That won't be a school board election or a community election. That is an election about a history, a language, literature, sports, music, folklore. All of that is on the table when you make a decision of that nature, and as such, it should be a very robust process where everyone participates and all options, including independence, are at the table. Because Puerto Rico at one time fed its people on its own and took care of its own on its own. And now it has been, yes, a territory for many decades. And those that want to be a state have the right to aspire to that. But the process should be one that should be robust, where everybody participates and all options are on the table. And of course, ultimately, it will be a congressional decision, because eventually it comes back to Congress and it will be a congressional decision. And we'll have to see whether there will be an appetite for one side of the aisle or the other to agree to 2 additional senators and X number of members of the House of Representatives.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I have so many things to say. I'm Dominican, by the way, so I'm like thrilled to meet Congressman Espaillat and also for this initiative. I know you've been very, in a way, vocal and influential in the Dominican Republic, at least celebrating certain things that are relevant to both Dominicans there and Dominicans here, just like the $10 tax that we don't have to pay to go to Dominican Republic. I used to pay every time I buy.
I'm more concerned about the very expensive airline tickets.
But I wanted to say, since we're looking back now in the United States and the intervention in 1965, like the role of the United States, I have to say that the Samana Bay used to be a destination for former slaves from the United States to kind of find safe haven in the Dominican Republic, in what is now Dominican Republic. But nowadays, in DR, the racial relationships are not as good as back then. And we know that was because of Leonidas Trujillo. Do you think maybe there could be like a role in the Dominican Republic politics to also look back to our own situation and where did we actually got it wrong? And we started from being this safe haven from Africans American that used to be slaves, and now we have this very complicated relationship, even with our own skin color, for instance. So do you think from your position, I know you just received a visit from President Abinader like 3 weeks ago, so do you think this is something that maybe you could kind of put in their agenda, flash it out?
Well, I think that first that, not just in the Dominican Republic, but obviously here in the United States, race matters, right? And ethnicity matters. And you don't just need to go to the Dominican Republic to talk about a race issue. In Staten Island, a man was choked to death while he said that he couldn't breathe 11 times. And the Puerto Rican guy that filmed him got indicted. The police officer that choked him got exonerated. And the district attorney that failed to prosecute the police officer got a promotion to Congress. So this is right here in America, in New York City. So you don't need to go that far to understand the impact of race and ethnicity. I think it matters. And I think it's a societal process backed by the law, right? Somebody used to say, your ability to be racist stops at the tip of my nose. You can feel and think what you want, but you cannot perpetrate that hate against me. It stops at the tip of my nose. And so, yes, I think that this piece of legislation will take a deep dive and find out just exactly how many people were killed during the intervention. What was the impact of the Trujillo dictatorship on society and the economy, right? And race. What happened during the 12 years of Balaguer when there was a major effort to attack and eliminate young activists? What were the economic interests behind the interventions and the occupations? And these are all questions that I think will shed light on who we are and will make us stronger when we get the right answer. When we get the answer that's out there that perhaps Congress has the ability to unearth. So yes, race matters, but not just in the Dominican Republic. It matters in my district as well.
Congressman, thanks so much for coming today. Given that you're also from New York and Caribbean interest, you seem to have a lot in common with Chairman Gregory Meeks, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I was curious if you've had any conversations with him or have gotten to know people on the committee to perhaps see if you could get your bill up on an upcoming markup and what the prospects of that could be.
Well, first, I was a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And once I got to become a member of Appropriations, since it's a standalone committee, Appropriation, I was asked to leave Foreign Affairs. I'm trying to get a waiver back there again. And then I'm in heaven, right? Because I tell the speaker that Appropriations is my head, but Foreign Relations is my heart. And she doesn't want a member of Congress walking around with that heart. So I need to get that waiver. So the first step is to ask him to waive me back, help me waive back into the committee, and then to get it on the market.
Congressman, thanks so much again for being here. Could you take us through like a day in the life of being in Congress, from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed?
Don't believe the hype first. My knees hurt in the morning. No, it's a very busy day. Well, I'll give you a brief breakdown of what happened this weekend. Right? So, the mayor of the city of New York was flying to Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. It was like a 34-hour trip. We were able to make it. We come back, have a press conference the next day to report. As soon as I'm done with that, of course, there is the relief efforts, right? The community had a telethon. They raised $250,000 to send back to the DR. They shipped a plane load with medicine because people don't know. After the hurricanes, you had the outbreak of dengue and some mosquito-driven diseases, right? So they're preparing 2-3 weeks ahead. And this weekend, I go down to Texas to help a fellow Democrat down on the border in McAllen, Texas. And of course, I come back late last night hoping that Aaron Judge hit that home run, and only to find out that he's still choking. and then this morning I'm here. I'll get back to the district and do district work, and then on Thursday I'll fly out to Florida for some more political work. So that's sort of like in a capsule.
Okay, I have a quick follow-up to that too. I know that campaign finance and fundraising is a big thorn for members of Congress, and I know you hear like upwards of 40% of one's time it would be fundraising is just by necessity. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about fundraising, how much time that just by necessity you have to do that, and thoughts about that.
Well, this election cycle, fortunately, I didn't have my races were not that competitive, so I wasn't so like with my back against. I'm not a rich dude, right? So I have to spend a little bit more time than everybody else. But yeah, it takes a lot, and there should be campaign finance reform, no question about it. I mean, level the playing field, let everybody run. As I said to some of the students here, when I run, I lose 20 pounds and I go through 3 pairs of shoes. I just pick up the weight by Thanksgiving, so.
Congressman, thank you so much for all your comments. Just going back to your points that your rank and file members might benefit from some more authority. I was wondering what your role was during some of the major landmark legislations from this past term, the CARES Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. Did you notice you or any other rank and file members had a say or role in a specific part of the process?
Well, yes. Every piece of legislation, I ask my staff, what's my role in it? What skill do I have in the game in this one? How is it going to help my constituents? What is it? If we're going to do healthcare reform, I have a bunch of people with diabetes, so you better include insulin there. That's correct. They didn't want to include insulin. Cap it at 35. I have people rationing insulin because they don't have the money to take the dosage that they need to take on a regular basis. And so, of course, I want insulin as one of those prescription drugs that are going to be lower. We're going to be able to negotiate the price. And so every single piece, right, I have to find out, and I make sure that I know how it impacts my constituencies, and then I carve out my space to advocate for that particular change, yes. So, infrastructure, right? I got a subway to build, the Second Avenue subway, right? But not just a subway, because we already had the first phase of the Second Avenue subway, 3 stops, right? Through the Silk-Stocking district, which is the wealthiest zip codes in the city of New York. Except now the second phase is going up to Harlem, right? So it's not just about a $7 billion project for 3 stops. What about the jobs? Talk to me about the jobs first, backwards, right? Talk to me about the jobs first, and how many jobs are coming to the district for young people to make prevailing wage and lift them to the middle class. That's the skin in the game for me with regards to the Second Avenue subway.
Thank you so much for coming, Congressman. You said you represent a very iconic, I'm also from New York, so I know how iconic your district is.
I wouldn't have guessed it. And you're probably from Brooklyn too, right?
Queens.
Queens?
With a very diverse community, there's so many competing and conflicting interests, so I was wondering how you find that consensus in your constituency to know which issues to advocate for and which ones to not advocate for at that time.
It's very tough. Yeah, that's a very good question. Very tough because they're very strong neighborhoods, right? Strong personalities, character, right? And they have their own personality. They know what they want. Very often they're competing with each other, so it's really a balance, a very delicate balance. So when I do earmarks, right, I make sure that the funding is distributed equitably across the district, that there's not one neighborhood that claims to have like an advantage over the other, that got so much more over the other. I have a district office in Harlem, in Washington Heights, and in the Bronx. So it's a very delicate balance. And of course, if everybody's upset at you, you're doing the right thing, and if everybody's happy at you, then you're doing the right thing. But no, it's very tough, right? And it keeps you on your toes, it keeps you laser focused, and I think it makes you a better legislator, because you're aware that you have to deliver for everybody, and you can't have one neighborhood have privilege over the other.
Give me a chance for one more.
If nobody's anything related, more related, I want to ask what happened, where were you on January 6th?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I want to hear that story.
Well, I was heading down to Chambers, and the police, the Capitol Police, came, as I was getting down there, came and stopped me. They wanted to escort me. So I went back to my office, I stayed in my office. They escorted people to like a special. I decided to stay in my office because we had staff there. I didn't want to sort of like get in a protected area and then leave my staff out to fence for themselves. Now, I had been there early. I came to the office early, so when I walked in, I found it irregular that many of these folks were walking around unimpeded. They were walking right next to me, the sidewalk, as I came into the building. I was talking to them. So I found it kind of strange that the security was so lax. And then, of course, after when we went down to Chamber to vote, I was one of the first down there, and believe me, it was a rough night, and it could have gotten a lot worse.
I think with that, I ask you to join me in thanking Congressman Espaillat for
Thank you. You're all welcome to come to the district, and by that time, Aaron Judge would have hit his 60s. Thank you.